I welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and we are absolutely delighted today to have our distinguished speaker today, Professor Katherine Marshall, who's a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. You must get that right. That'll be part of the quiz. But she also leads, and the reason we have Katherine Marshall here today is because she leads the Berkley Center's initiative on religion and global development. And she has a long and distinguished history with the World Bank, where she led a number of initiatives, especially the World Bank's faith and ethics work between 2000 and 2006. And it's in that occasion, one of those occasions when she was at the World Bank, that I had the good fortune to meet Professor Marshall there and became familiar with some of her work. And we found that her presence here today would deeply enrich us to share with us some of her insights on the question of religion and development. Now, Professor Marshall is also associated with Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, and she's also the executive director of something that started out at the World Bank as an NGO, and now that NGO is now placed within the Berkley Center, called the World Faith Development Dialogue, if I got that right. Professor Marshall graduated from Wellesley College and has an MPA, Masters in Public Administration from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And she has authored a number of very, very important articles, but I will highlight two books that she co-authored. One that she co-authored with Marissa van Sanen, Development and Faith, where mind, heart, and the soul work together. And she also co-authored with Lucy Q, is that correct, Q or Q? Mind, Heart, and Soul in the Fight Against Poverty. She's also worked on other elements of development and reconstruction, and she will share with us a great deal about some of the work she's done in different places, but particularly the area that we are most interested in, that is the whole issue of faith, religion, and development. But she also writes a blog, and that's important, called Faith in Action for Newsweek, Washington Post website, Our Faith, and I think that's one of the places that we should keep on following her and see what kind of developments emerge from time to time, because this field and this area of religion development is a very, very small number of people work in that area. And she is one of the pioneers in this field and has made this field come alive in a variety of ways, both through her practical experience as working in doing development work, but also knowledge in public policy and the understanding on questions of religion and faith. And we talked about a number of initiatives that she's been busy with in different places on the question of women and gender in some parts of the world, but she's also worked on a number of distinguished World Economic Forum initiatives called the Council of 100, that was to advance understanding between the Islamic world and the West. She's also a member she also serves on the Council on Foreign Relations, and she is a trustee of Princeton University, which is a very important post to hold, and I'm sure there's a great deal of development work that goes on in that area too. And she also serves on IDEA, the International Development Ethics Association, and has advised a number of non-governmental organizations, including the important organization called CARE. But most important, I think, to give us an insight on a different dimension of Professor Marshall's CV, is that she also serves as part of the Fez Festival of World Sacred Music since its inception, and that is the city of Fez in Morocco that has this annual Sacred Music Film Festival, Festival of World Sacred Music. And that tells us that the arts is very, very much close to her heart, and she shared with us some of those insights when I was talking to her earlier this afternoon, and how art and development is absolutely joined in many ways. And I think one of the guests who were here also talked about the importance of art, and some scholars trying to begin to think about interfaith relationships through art and artistic development. So I think there's a very important area, and she has her finger on that pulse too. So please help me to welcome Katherine Marshall to deliver the lecture.
thank you. I'm delighted to be here to meet some old friends and to have a chance to have an exchange. Could I ask a favor that when I talk too long, you just tell me to stop so that we have enough time to have some questions? And I have to find the mouse. Is this? Okay. First, just on a point, if you ever want to see my blog, the Washington Post on faith sort of went in a different direction, and so it's the HuffPost that I write for now, the religion page of the Huffington Post. Okay, here's what I'm going to try to do. First, I'm going to sort of say what this is about, introduce it, and give some caveats. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why this has not been an easy subject, some of the tensions, but also some of the synergies. Then I'll go through a somewhat historical account of how the religion and development worlds have come into contact. I want to highlight some issues that have emerged from the 6 or 7 year work that we've been doing at Georgetown, and just to give a preview of that, in 6 world regions and looking at about 10 development topics. The ones that have come out in every single one of them are, first of all, issues around governance, which includes corruption, but includes much more broadly the sort of role of the state, role of private, role of religion. Secondly, poor coordination, which of course for those of you who work in development is a perennial issue, aid coordination and harmonization. The issue, which is very specific to religion, though interestingly it's something you hear about in other cases, proselytizing. The reason I say you hear about it in other cases is that from many religious voices you hear that human rights is proselytizing, that child rights or women's rights, that's what it's about. And finally, issues of gender. And finally, assuming that I get to it, I'll talk about some issues of where we're going, and really would welcome very much your inputs and your ideas on that. Why is this not working? Okay, well, that seems to work. First of all, how did I get into this? And what do I know and what don't I know? This is sort of the credential part of it. I worked in the World Bank for a long time, working mostly on Africa and Latin America, on East Asia. In fact, I worked with Francis Latham in many ways. We were sort of pioneers of the thinking that institutions were important over many years. Very operational. And then I was drafted by the then president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfenson, to work on an initiative he'd started in 1999 with the Archbishop of Canterbury. The basic context then, something that is part of our history but not necessarily live in people's minds, is that those were the days of intensive protests. Seattle, Genoa, people were being killed. Every time you had a meeting, you had chain link fences around them, tremendous tension. There was the movement towards Jubilee 2000, the issues on debt, issues on structural adjustment, et cetera. And for Wolfenson and for others, the fact that the Catholic Church and other churches were deeply involved in these protests and angry at the development institutions seemed an anomaly, because the view was that these were the people who cared about the poor, these institutions. And so through a series of sort of coincidences, Wolfenson and the Archbishop of Canterbury got together with the Aga Khan, with atGeorgetown from the Vatican, with Prince Talal, actually, of Jordan, Jeff Solomon, who's with the Bronfman Foundation, in other words, sort of an interfaith group. And they had a couple of meetings, first at Lambeth Palace in London and then in Washington, and basically decided to launch a new initiative and to start an institution, the World Faiths Development Dialogue, and I was drafted to work on this, knowing nothing about the topic whatsoever. So everything that I have learned has been through a process of organic process, let's put it this way. Totally fascinating. I say that I discover a new denomination, a new religion every day, meet the most fascinating people, so gradually I have been drawn into it. But it is not something I've studied. I'm very much a practitioner who's now called a scholar practitioner, I think. What's interesting about the World Bank story is that of all the institutions around, the last place you would have expected an interest in the world of religion was the World Bank. This was before 9/11. It was at a time when there was nothing. I mean, and still in the World Bank's library, there's no category for religion. So there were a lot of antibodies, and this is true across the United Nations system. In fact, I've been now to about 8 of the European aid agencies talking in one way or another about religion and development, because they all have this sort of uneasy sense that there's something there they ought to know, something that's important, but they haven't figured out exactly how to do it. But recently, of course, post 9/11 particularly, religion has taken on a lot of significance with extremism and security. There's at least some sense, the Millennium Development Goals, which I'm sure you know by heart, in the year 2000, Goal 8 is partnerships, and religious institutions should be part of the partnerships. Everyone knows that culture is important for development. Religion and culture in very complex ways are intertwined. And of course, religion is very much intertwined with politics. But before I move on to the next thing, I'm going to tell you one story, which is one that stands out in my mind. I was the country director for the Sahel department. That included Mauritania, and I was visiting Mauritania at a very tense time. It was a time when there were extrajudicial killings. There had been a lot of refugees moving from Senegal to Mauritania, from Mauritania to Senegal. There were actually also Tuareg refugees in an earlier incarnation in the north of Mauritania. The donors were up in arms because of the human rights abuses. The World Bank had no mandate to talk about human rights, but we were chairing the consultative group. So in any event, I found myself with the Minister of Agriculture, who had just moved from the military. He was a military guy, to the Ministry of Agriculture, driving towards the Senegal Valley, which is where there was a lot of this tension. So I had to find a topic to talk to him about, because he didn't want to be with this woman from the World Bank. That was clear. And he didn't want to hear what I had to say. So I started out asking him about camels, because Mauritania has lots of camels. He knew every camel in Mauritania by name. He probably owned half of them. We knew about the trade from camels from Libya. We talked about meat, milk, hides, hoofs, you name it. Moved on to cattle. He wasn't quite so interested, but he knew something about that. And then I went on to sheep and goats. Yeah, it's not important. Anyway, we came to the valley. And so I looked around. We were in a typical African village, and there were, everywhere I looked, donkeys. Be it children riding on donkeys, water, wood, thatch for the roofs, everything. So I said to him, what about donkeys? So he said with great confidence, on n'a pas d'âne, we don't have any donkeys. So I looked around and said, well, what are those? And so then he came back to me with ça n'a pas d'importance, it's not important. What I take from this is that you can have something staring you in the face, and you don't see it, if it's not part of your world view and your world vision. And one of the interesting things about the world, particularly the world of religion, for a lot of the secular development institutions, is that they just don't see it. It's not there. There's a lot of rationalization. I'll come back to that in a minute. But it really has been an extraordinary awakening to realize how far people literally don't see something that is right in front of their eyes. And if it's not part of your intellectual architecture, if it's not part of your theory of change, if it's not part of the way you see the world, you don't have a way of processing it. So in fact, one of the comments one of my colleagues made about religion and development is that there's no file in the brain for religion. You don't know where to put it. But in any event, part of the story, and I don't want to have this consume the entire talk that I'm giving today, but it is important, and it's very much part of my experience. Wolfenson was a dynamic president. He announced this. He had these high-level meetings with princes and archbishops and swamis and Sikhs and you name it, these remarkable meetings which for many people were transformational. And he had Bain and Company do a pro bono study of how to set up this organization. And so we set off and started doing this, at which point all hell broke loose. And the way that Wolfenson describes it is that it was 184 countries to 0 for the World Bank doing something on religion. He was exaggerating a little bit, but it is clear that the executive directors, the management of the World Bank, was not in any way supportive. There was some tepid support from some. And so we had to do a lot of thinking about why, what were the objections. And so in many ways we have a unique experience because we did talk to the representatives of every one of those 184 countries through the executive directors and tried to understand what it was that were the issues. I also was just fascinated that this very sophisticated management consulting firm had utterly and totally missed that there were all kinds of landmines in these areas. But when I give this presentation, which I do in different ways in different places, it's amazing how many echoes there are to this day. And so we're making some progress, particularly because in Europe, with the Muslim minorities, it's really forced people to rethink the role of religion and the ways that it operates with development. But do remember, you know, the latest Pew survey is showing that for 85% of the world's people, religion is important. These are huge and complicated institutions, and yet it is something that has not been on the radar screens of people working in international affairs, certainly not economics, and to a large extent development. So that's essentially the context of a 12-year journey that I have been involved in first of all trying to fill the gaps in knowledge, but secondly to try to address this very complex set of reasons of why people find it so difficult. This is a Zapiro cartoon. You'll appreciate this from a wonderful South African cartoonist, which is basically the religious minefield, which we very much are part of. So basically, to put it, I'm going to put this very quickly, and we can come back to any of it that's interesting to any of you. But essentially, the reasons why people have objected to dealing with religion in development, I caricature. I don't characterize it. I caricature as 3 Ds and an E. And the 3 Ds, the first one is that religion is divisive. It's political. And they're all fighting each other. They have ulterior motives. They're really about power. Basically, it's competitive. Proselytizing is very fundamental. It's something that comes up all the time. So that essentially that you're just getting into very dangerous territory as soon as you touch religion. And it's not really about what they say it's about. It's really about politics and power and influence. So that's sort of the first set of concerns that you get. I actually had, I think, several of the European executive directors really said, you know, we just don't want to have anything to do. But at the working level, we also had people who would say, no, you just cannot talk to the imam, because the imams are going to get you into trouble as soon as you talk to the imam or the pastor. The second issue, which has been very important, is the sense that basically religion is the opposite of development, that religion stands in the way of development. And no issues are more important than gender and reproductive health. But that essentially you're talking about patriarchy, you're talking about the status quo. And the HIV/AIDS debates have brought this out. I mean, just take a look at all the commentary right now. I follow the cartoonists. I love it. But the cartoonists on the papal resignation and the conclave are classic. I mean, but of course, they're all men, you know, and they're all older men. So this goes absolutely in conflict with a fundamental premise of the development community, which is that women, empowerment, women, whatever you want to call it, is fundamental to modernization and social change. So even though, by the way, there are some religious traditions which have been at the absolute forefront of women's rights and of working for women, the Quakers among them, really part of it, you still have this sort of collective lump of an image of religion being anti-women, being patriarchal. And the fact that when you get a big interreligious meeting, they're all boys, doesn't help. And so even on the HIV/AIDS issue, every time some bishop issues something that says condoms have leaks, 33 people will send me the email, and basically with the message, you see, it's hopeless. The third is that religion is basically defunct, and it's the theory that with modernization, religion becomes much less important. And therefore, and this to me in some ways has been the worst enemy that we've faced, it's not a priority. It's not important. And that is, I'm sure that those of you, all of you, have read enough of the literature to know that this was the assumption for a long time, that religion would become less important. Whether it's Marx or Time magazine, God is Dead, or whatever it is, the assumption was that with modernization, religion would simply become less important, would retreat into the private. This is not true. People talk about a resurgence of religion, which I'm a little bit more skeptical about. I don't think we really know whether people's beliefs or the depths of beliefs have changed. I like something that Karen Armstrong said once, which is that it is like a revelation. And this comes back a bit to my Mauritanian minister story, that what revelation means is removing the veil. So in other words, it was there all the time, but people didn't see it. They weren't aware of it. And of course, the other fact is that religion is changing fundamentally with plural societies and so forth. So it's a very dynamic field, a very dynamic world, despite what appearances aside. But still, that's the idea persists that religion is backward, that it's going out of style, that progressive people don't have to deal with it, and so it's not part of international relations programs, it's not part of political science, it's not part of economics, and you have a separation of worlds. The final one is sort of my own observation. I was part of the development world when there were almost no women in anything except secretarial positions, and when gender and development was something people giggled at if it was mentioned. And I sort of lived through the awakening of people about what it was, that gender and women were important. It's still not, it's not a one case. Trying to get people to take gender issues seriously is still extraordinarily difficult. But what I found was that many people dealing with gender dealt with it with their emotions, not necessarily with their brains. And that's because it affects everybody from the time they wake up until the time they go to sleep. It's part of your life. It's more than race, more than religion, more than anything else. It's relationships between men and women, and therefore people are very emotional about it. And I found the same thing with religion, that what people's reactions to religion is, this is what I believe. This is not, it's important to the people of the Gambia, or it's important to the people of Indonesia, or this is the way it works. It's what do I believe? And that's made it extraordinarily difficult. I call that the E, that's the emotional. To go on, you know, there were just as many doubts on the religious side, and there are just as many to this day. And just to go through these very quickly, I have 5 E's and a D. Yeah. The first one is that development and the development institutions are really about empire. They're about power, U.S. hegemony, etc. This is all a plot. It's about greed. It's about the market, etc. The second is the sense that the development institutions are mute on ethics, and that it's really that this greed is the creed, etc., is a big issue. It's an interesting thing. I worked in the World Bank for many years and certainly felt a drive and a passion that had nothing to do with religion. And Wolfenson used to get so angry when people would sort of accuse the bank of being unethical, and he would say, we cede the ethical high ground to no one. But there is something that I've seen much more clearly, which is that in an institution that tries desperately to be fair, using statistics and dry language and so forth, the ethical issues are muted. And I don't think religious institutions are more ethical. I really don't think they're more ethical, to reveal my own bias. But they certainly have thought about it and articulated it better. And that's been a tremendous gift to the development community, if it would care to look at it. Fourth thing is that economics is seen as theology, and it's amazing how many times you hear this, that it's rigid, it believes in unseen hands, that people preach, They don't listen. I mean, this sense that this fear of economics is very deeply ingrained. And finally, there's just these institutions are totally enigmatic. Sort of, how do they work? What do they do? The International Monetary Fund, the bank, all these regional banks, what on earth is going on? It's really the enigma. And the upshot of it is that development is dangerous. Now, just to come back and say why this is so important, first of all, coming back to this focus on the poor and marginalized populations, the incredible, extraordinary synergy in the focus on poverty and justice and equity. Catholic social teaching, in many ways, was ahead of the development institutions, the World Council of Churches and the ecumenical movement. There's a lot in the Islamic traditions and Buddhist traditions, which really are vital for thinking about why poverty matters and what you do about it. The sheer size of religious institutions is something that Rick Warren, who's the pastor of megachurch Saddleback, he spoke a couple of weeks ago, but I've heard him over maybe 8 years now, and every time he does the same thing. He shows you this map of Rwanda where there are 3 hospitals and there are 18 clinics and there are 500 churches. So the basic message is this is the largest distribution system in the world. It's physical infrastructure, employees. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has 450,000 deacons. And something like 100,000 imams was the figure that I was given a few years ago. So this reach and depth, and a comment that the religious people make all the time, particularly in relation to the NGOs, is we've been here for decades, we're going to be here when you're dead. You just come, the sort of carpetbagger, briefcase NGOs, we're part of the fabric. Now that's not always true, but still that certainly is the image. They grapple with ethical issues, and there's overlap in the activities, I say, from AIDS to zebras. I mean, literally, any development issue, you've got religious institutions involved. I mean, we had a challenge earlier this year from the UN Foundation to look at energy access. I didn't think we were going to find much in religious institutions working in energy access. We have a whole report that just came out of, but trafficking, agriculture, land tenure, you name it. There are incredibly rich religious insights that you can get if you look at them. The genius of communication. I had an experience once where I went to a conference in Senegal, and I was speaking between Jesse Jackson and the Reverend Leon Sullivan when I was still with the World Bank, and praise the Lord, as we say, I decided not to give a World Bank statistics speech and did something else. But it was a terrifying experience to be between these 2 guys whose genius for communication was really something. I did well enough that Sullivan called me the Reverend Marshall from then on. And then this point that I was making before of authenticity and durability, that we're talking about the long haul. Now that can mean slowness, it can mean all sorts of things, it can mean patriarchy. Now the final issue which has come up, and some of you have read a couple of pieces that I have, but one accusation that we get all the time, and it is, and I know perfectly well I would never do this, but it is this instrumentalization. Because you do get from the development community, they hear this and they say, oh great, let's use the religious institutions to send a message about hand washing, or let's use them to get every child to be vaccinated, or whatever. And that's this instrumentalization. So what you need is obviously something that's more like a partnership. But in any event, this is an issue that comes up all the time. So to go through, I'm going to zip through 10 different historic phases, which overlap, but which basically give you a sense of how religion and development have evolved. The first is that for most of certainly the World Bank's, development is really post-World War II, and really late 50s when you start really to see the kinds of thinking that we know about today. And through almost all of that history, engagement with faith institutions has been sporadic to nil. Somebody described ships passing in the night, really just no research, almost no research, very little thinking. There were individual initiatives, but they were not documented. In fact, when you go to an institution like the World Bank, there are a lot of people who studied theology, but they certainly don't talk about it. So what happened, and this is still true, I mean, just for example, the person within the UN system who's been the most insightful and the most active on working with religion was Thoraya Obaid, who was the head of the UN Population Agency, UNFPA. And she was passionate about these issues during her tenure. But she left. You know, Wolfenson left. After Wolfenson left, they closed down the unit completely, just cut it down completely. Thoraya Obaid, her successor, is interested, but it's not anything part of his central focus. So it was tied to the person completely, which means in institutions that it can die. There was no training, nobody, and one thing we find quite often is that people find it terrifying. I talked to a group of managers from the World Bank's Latin American region, and so they said, well, that sounds really important. We really should know something about the Pentecostals, we should know something about the evangelicals, the Catholic Church, but what is the Catholic Conference of Bishops, and how is that different from the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and where do the Jesuits come in, and what about this? They really have no way of framing this. I got myself caught in a book. I have a book that's just come out within the last few days called Global Institutions of Religion. And so I am hoping that will help to fill some of this gap. But I can tell you it's been held aright because there's nothing like it. In other words, it's sort of how does the institutional structure work? There's no category in bibliographies, nothing in the library, no visible research or evaluation, and so there's no record and no learning. So that was the first phase. The next phase, which I alluded to before, is that there was a lot of tension and criticism. And that came particularly with the whole sort of NGO critique that started to focus on the World Bank and on the other development institutions. And the religious voices were very much part of that. I think the one you may have heard of the most is the Jubilee 2000 movement, which was focused on poor country debt, which came out of in two parallel initiatives from both the Anglican Communion and the Catholic Church, were the two sort of streams, and looked to biblical teachings and precedents to say that there should be a forgiveness of debt. But there was also plenty of other activities that were very strident in their criticism. In fact, one wonderful piece, I should have sent it to you as reading, is that the World Council of Churches came up with something whose title is Lead Us Not Into Temptation, which was basically about whether there should be a dialogue with the IMF and the World Bank. So basically you get the idea of the tail and the ears and so forth of what these institutions represented. Third, though, was that an important change in the bank, an important step, and this I think has influenced a lot, was a huge study that was done called The Voices of the Poor, which essentially listened to poor communities, people from poor communities all over the world. It's published in a series of books. But it's one of these studies that had a major influence on thinking. And one of the findings of this was that when people were asked who they trusted, very often the top was religious leaders. And sort of the importance of thinking about the meaning of life and purpose of life and the complexity of that in poverty was something that really came out. So that has had a marked impact on a number of people. The whole civil society revolution has clearly been important. One complicated issue is how far religion is part of civil society. Now, one thing to realize is if you look at the size of religion and you look at the NGO world, the religion completely dwarfs the whole NGO world. But they're very uneasy relationships. And you'll get a lot of church people. I mean, clearly you have the World Vision, CRS, ADRA, and all those other big NGOs that have a religious link that are part of the sort of NGO consultations. But you have a lot of them saying, we're not just an NGO. We're not civil society. So there are a lot of questions and tensions, but clearly the opening up of civil societies had a major role. Debt issues I've mentioned as a critical issue. Another issue that's come up and that we haven't really made much headway on, but one of the realizations in the development community is that, as some people would say, that it's chaos. There's so many institutions. Just to give you an idea, this is a very simplified diagram of AIDS funding in one African country. In other words, it's called spaghetti. It's total chaos. Nobody can understand it. 30,000 reports due to the Tanzania. Now, the problem is that the religious institutions and activities are, in many ways, the worst, because many of them don't like to work with governments. They're suspicious of governments. They want to work on their own. They don't report. They often don't have accounts. The funding is very opaque. So we think in our little group that looking at the funding and the aid coordination and harmonization, how these groups fit with that is very important. But that's another realization that people have. The sort of MDGs, the efforts to try to bring a common voice in the world to end poverty, the year of development, all of those have brought in very late, but have brought in religious voices. There's something called the Micah Challenge, which is an evangelical movement. There's Religions for Peace has a handbook on the MDGs. The World Parliament of Religions at their last meeting had a major section. I actually ran 22 programs on it during the Parliament. So there's an effort to try to bring these worlds together around this common sense of that fighting poverty is a global priority. The eighth is really the Paul Collier insight paradigm shift. I find it fascinating that we talk about the third world, but I suspect many of you have forgotten, if you ever knew, what the second world was, because there hasn't been the second world, which was the Soviet Union and its allies since 1989. But even talking about developing countries and developed countries is a nonsense in today's world, because it's a much, much more complex geopolitical, economic, social view. But there is the awareness that we are looking at a bunch of countries, which may be the bottom billion, and maybe 56 countries, maybe 25 countries, that are stuck at the bottom. And what I can guarantee you is that every single one of those, religion plays a critical role. And what I can also say is that in the World Bank's reports and Tony Blair's reports, the British government, nobody's looked at religion in relation to conflict countries and post-conflict and the poorest countries. And it's vitally important. So it's just crying out for PhD theses, for action, because it's complicated, because every country is different. The factors, they're positive and negative. I mean, you look at northern Uganda, it's completely different from DRC, which is not very far away. But still, it's extraordinary how much it's been neglected. Service delivery, this has been an obvious one. Just to give you an idea, this is sort of on the knowledge issue. You have Ban Ki-moon talking about 40% of Africa's health care is provided by religious institutions and 50% of education. The estimates of how much of Africa's health care is provided by religious institutions range from 7 to 70%. Now, I don't know what that tells you. What it tells me is that we don't have a clue. We do have a clue, actually, because we've done a study for the Tony Blair Faith Foundation that sort of looked at all the evidence and all the information. But it's amazing how these numbers stick. And this number, 40%, part of it comes from the Vatican. I love them, but one of the things they've come up with is that the 29.6% of AIDS care is provided by the Catholic Church. Now, of course, what's the denominator? I mean, we have no idea where that number comes from, and nobody can tell us where the number comes from. But as somebody said, well, the Protestants must be at least 10%, so 40% sounds reasonable. In fact, what it is it's widely varied, and it goes from almost nothing in a country like Gabon to at least 50, 60 in DRC. But the point is, education and health, religious institutions of many kinds are critically important. There's no way that you can achieve health and education goals if you don't do that. They're also very important in dealing with disabled. They're very important in dealing with the very poor. So it's an absolutely critical element. And in many ways, it's the one that the development world can really get their minds around most easily. And then the 10th that I'm looking at is that there's a lot of activity around climate change and religion. And there are a lot of alliances. There's something called the Alliance of Religions for Conservation, which is based in the UK. There's some research. There have been a lot of presence. But so far, there's really not been a thoughtful way of looking at how the religious insights, voice, mobilization can be part of the climate change issue. Just to come back to the issues I mentioned at the beginning, because I want to stop, the issues that have come out of, we've been doing 7 years of research at the Berkley Center that's also complemented about 5 or 6 years that we were doing when I was in the World Bank. But just to highlight the issues that have come out in 6 regional surveys we've done. All these are available on the Berkley Center website or the WFDD. We've done about 10 topic reviews. Sort of housing, gender, corruption, tuberculosis, malaria, agriculture, water. So we've sort of taken almost all the development issues and said, what's religion got to do with it? And there are some issues that have come out in all of them that I think are ones that we really want to focus on. The first one is governance. How do you deal with corruption? How do you deal with accountability? What is the role of the state? What should be the role of the state? How do you involve the religious actors who are so much part of the social fabric in these issues? Almost every secular institution, but also a lot of religious ones, will highlight that proselytizing is a major source of tension. But what is it? What are the limits? And I think in development, religious freedom issues take on a new cast. And essentially, what you have is, at least in the humanitarian world, you have a very clear dividing line that any kind of conditionality or selection when you're dealing with people who are desperate is immoral. So most people will agree with that, though there are some who say spiritual needs are more important than material needs and therefore you can't separate them, that it's artificial to separate them. But the sort of UN law, humanitarian law, is pretty clear on that. When it comes to development, it's much more complicated. How do you deal with education, with values? I have some stories on that that I can tell you later if we have time. How do you deal with those issues? And so we really need to look at the codes of conduct, and we need to look at the issues and the way people see them. I've already mentioned the coordination issue. And then finally, I've also mentioned that in the development world, there's really no issue that people think is as important as changing gender relationships and having equality for women. You have many religious institutions that will say the same thing. You look at any NGO that has a religious background and they'll talk about gender equality, but there are some fundamental questions about what equality means and how do you deal with that. And we think that there needs to be a lot of discussion about that in a lot of settings. So finally, on the way to go forward, one thing we believe, and we've done a lot of work, particularly in Cambodia as a sort of a pilot, is that until you get to the country level, you can't make this very specific. So you need to have country studies. What's the story in Kenya? What's the story in Mali? What's the story in Indonesia, Burma, Sudan, et cetera? You really need to say, okay, what's the religious composition? What are the issues? What's the legal framework within which it operates? What's the history and what are their current roles in development, whether it's water or AIDS or whatever? Got to have more evidence. I mean, this is one of the big problems, is that there's almost no solid evidence, almost no evaluation that's done of these programs. And that, of course, is a major obstacle. It's where in gender, when you started seeing the benefits of girls' education, you started to change people's minds. And so that's why we're doing a lot of work in evidence. But you also need what we call discernment, common sense, intelligence, thoughtful discussion that gets beyond the emotions. We really need that. And we need to be willing to deal with dialogue on tough issues, including abortion, proselytizing, roles of women within families. Some of these tough issues we need to be willing to try to see if we can't find more common ground. Religious institutions have to bring women into the picture because otherwise they're missing a huge part of the issues and the voices. Everyone's interested in networks. What do they look like? And then in these global forums, whether it's the Tuberculosis Alliance or the World Malaria or the Global Fund, finding ways to get religion represented in an important way is practically is important. A lot of people are very attracted to interfaith, and I would put that the Obama administration. And the reason is that people are quite concerned if you're supporting. I mean, if you actually looked after the tsunami or after the Haiti earthquake at the list of organizations that were recommended, they were all Christian, with one or two exceptions. So one thing that people turn to is interfaith organizations. The problem is interfaith works sometimes, but not always. Because particularly if you try to get all religions involved in an issue, it can be very cumbersome. But one thing that it's what the Habitat calls the theology of the hammer, is that if you can get people working on a concrete problem together, then when there's a crisis, they'll be able to work together because they know each other. One of my favorite stories, I saw it personally, so I'm sure it's at least mostly true. In Ghana, there was something called the Crusade Against Filth, which was an inter-religious alliance against garbage and for sanitation. And the idea was there was a big football match coming in Accra. People were ashamed of how filthy it was in the churches, and the Muslims and everybody all got together. It was the Muslims who called it the Crusade. They all got together to work on garbage, and the World Bank got all excited about it at the time. The problem was that churches are really not made for garbage collection. They could run a couple of campaigns, they could go on the radio, but it was clear they were looking for money. They wanted some money to, I don't know, buy a garbage truck. I don't know what they really had in mind, but they certainly were. They were disappointed that they didn't get more sort of, tangible benefits from this initiative that they took, which everyone was very excited about. But when there was an election crisis, the fact that these people knew each other actually made a difference in staving off violence in Accra. That's what I was told by a number of the bishops concerned. So that, I think, is the idea of interfaith, and it's the idea of trying to work not on talking about theology, but on doing things together for the common good. That is something that is very promising. So that's all. We have at least some time for questions.
Please help me to thank Professor Marshall. In a very clear and succinct way, you've put a number of things on the table, so the floor is open now for questioning. And do you mind taking your own questions?
Happy to. Yes.
So I'm interested in how the conditionality goes both ways. So religious organizations wanting their beliefs to be front and center maybe, but then the human rights framework wanting human rights and gender equality to be front and center. What's going on with that tension?
Well, there's a lot of tension around it, clearly, because for some organizations, for example, CRS, Catholic Relief Services, if you read their reports and their proposals, they look like CARE. And even World Vision, which really began as a very evangelical organization, has modified itself, partly because certainly in the United States and Europe and most of the sources of aid, and I think this is true also of Japan, public funding for development work by any institution cannot have an explicitly religious dimension, so that the organizations have learned to use the language and to have policies that keep these two separate. What's happening, but clearly, and this is one of the things that's tricky, is trying to sense, and this is where you get the mistrust, because you do have a lot of people who basically say, that's what they say, but that's not really what it's about. I don't really believe them. I mean, even running a hospital, there are people who would say that running the hospital is really not for an altruistic purpose or serving the poor, that it's really got a different motive. So I think that's the first thing you've got to deal with is enough understanding so that there's trust. And so you need for the development institutions to convince their religious counterparts, who are often working in the same areas, that their motivation is genuine, that they do care about the poor, which of course is something that they're profoundly skeptical about. And you need to persuade the development institutions that these religious groups are not motivated only by trying to convert or trying to raise money for their own purposes or lining their own pockets or any of the other things. So that, I think, is the first set of issues. And there's no way to build that kind of trust without some kind of dialogue and without people getting to know each other and having some sense of what kinds of people are involved. I think the other part of it that I feel is that there are complicated lines. I mean, one, we have on our website, about 250 interviews, I think, with practitioners. And it comes out of part of my experience at the World Bank, which is that the people who do work often don't write. They don't write academic articles. So their knowledge is very hard to tap into. And a lot of the research work doesn't reflect what the practitioners have to offer. So that's why we've done these interviews. But a lot of them probe these issues of sort of, why do you do this? And so one answer that you often get is, we don't tell people our beliefs, but if people ask us, we share our faith. And why? But the faith, faith is, one of my pet peeves at the moment is dividing the world into people of faith and people not of faith. Some people even talk about the faith sector, which to me is just a complete nonsense. You're dealing with thousands of different institutions and ways in which people believe and ways in which their religious beliefs affect the way they make decisions, or the way they live their secular lives affects what they're thinking about when they're in church. It's vastly more complicated than trying to divide the world into two. So I think that's now when it comes to, we spend a lot of time trying to say, look, there isn't a difference fundamentally. And in some areas, one of the first questions we were asking, okay, you go into a village and you're digging a well. Clearly there's no difference in the well between one that's done by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and one that's done by the government of Ethiopia, or one that's done by Save the Children. The technical side of it is very similar, and they need to be done well, and the accounting and so on needs to be done well. What probably is very different is the way that people would think about organizing people for maintenance. And so that's when you get into the sort of social fabric and how do you take that into account when you're looking at what are the pivotal problems for development, which is sustainability, which is, what is the word that we're using now? Resilience, that's the word of the day. Resilience, etc. These are all issues where having these community organizations are fundamentally part of the ways in which communities respond, whether to drought or to war or to reconciliation. So the first thing comes back to my donkeys. It's just not, the two worlds not seeing each other. And that, I think, is where, in a sense, where we are. Now, once you get there, you need to start answering the questions, why does it matter? In other words, what are the new insights? And what do you need to do to translate that into some kind of action? Now, some of it, there's some very interesting pilots, for example, on malaria, where the religious leaders in communities in Nigeria are trying to help, and Sierra Leone particularly, are trying to help in use of mosquito nets and in encouraging people to, but again, that's not very religious, but it's working with the communities and taking into account the communities. The religious side of it, it's hard to see that there's generically a different view. I think that some of the tough problems we're dealing with, like inequality, I I'm convinced that there could be insights coming from a dialogue with many of the different religious traditions into thinking about inequality in a modern setting. But there hasn't been very much of that. I think, so it's mostly, there's this whole side which is communication, and then there's the other side which is the substance of what kind of world are we trying to create. I think you probably, all of you know that there's a lot of excitement around gross national happiness, which is Bhutan. The king of Bhutan has sort of said we want to look at not a gross GDP, gross domestic product, but we want to look at gross national happiness. And in fact, there are elements of the Bhutanese approach even, and it's being discussed at the United Nations, which really are just saying we want to take the environment and the society and human capabilities and all these other themes into account. But there is also in Bhutan specifically a Buddhist element to it, which is interesting. And so one of the things that they've been trying to do is to measure spirituality. And I talked to the person who was organizing. It was quite interesting because one of the things he said is he does not look at attendance at the temple. But he does look at sort of conformity between belief and practice. In this case, it was vegetarianism was one of the issues, meditation. So in any event, it sort of really raises all kinds of interesting questions as to how you deal with that. Yes?
When you talked about the distrust going on between either the development groups or the religious institutions, what I'm curious is maybe on some of these smaller projects like with Mosquito Net or whatever, where you have seen cooperation on both sides, was there some kind of like a system of checks and balances that helped make that work? And I mean, do you think that like what was it that makes these small projects work that we might be able to apply to like a bigger partnership? I kind of wonder if some of the conflict is coming from, one side wanting to kind of mandate the other, or is it just these kinds of, faith-based issues versus economic issues?
Well, power is clearly an issue, and something that comes into a lot of the discussions. For example, on health and education, is the presumption that underlies some of the development community's thinking and actions, that it's a government responsibility to do things, and therefore anything that is non-governmental is in some senses a challenge to that. So when you're dealing, whether you're dealing with an evangelical school in a slum or a Catholic school system, you're quite often dealing with sort of what should be the non-public role and how should it be tied into an overall strategy to develop this. Different countries have handled it differently. I think there's 16 countries in Africa that have Christian health associations, which essentially, in almost all cases, have both the Catholic and the Protestant health systems. But you also have stories in a number of these countries where, I worked in Mozambique at one point, and the whole system was originally a Catholic system, and then it was nationalized completely, and everybody was thrown out, and then they were all brought back in, and then they were thrown out again, and then they were brought back in again. And you have the same story in a number of other countries. So, the first thing is sort of to develop some kind of a national approach. The place where you've seen this worked out, I guess the answer to your question maybe, where you've seen it most actively is in HIV/AIDS. And the reason for that is that it's, of course, a huge pandemic that has just shocked everyone. It's knocked the pants off of everyone, too, because, HIV/AIDS was unknown in 1981, sort of my daughter's life. And it's changed and mutated, and it's, you go into some countries where around a table, 1 in 4 people, 1 in less, is HIV positive, and that used to be a death sentence. And so you had there the example, what religion is the problem and the solution. The problem was particularly, I think, even more than the condom issue, which is not too clear how much difference that's really made in stopping people from using condoms. So it's it's dampened the enthusiasm of governments, but particularly contributing to stigma has been a major issue. As pastors refusing to bury people in the churchyard, and we all know that when you aren't tested for AIDS and when you hide it, that it contributes to the spread of the pandemic. So that's been an issue, and the tension around abstinence has been poisonous. There are all kinds of problems. But on the other hand, who was taking care of people in the villages who were dying? And to this day, there's an estimate that 90% of the AIDS orphans, there's supposed to be 16 million AIDS orphans, that 90% of them are being cared for, if they're cared for at all, in some kind of a religious community. And so you have seen on the AIDS issue a very complicated country-by-country progression into something coming close to respect and something coming close to some kind of an ability to work together. So that has been a sort of inadvertent. The one that we're working with actually right now, it's very interesting, is Habitat for Humanity, which is, I don't know if all of you know how religious Habitat is. It was founded 35 years ago. It's non-denominational, but it's very much a Christian organization. And it works to a large extent through the church networks. That's how you get volunteers. They've got 1 million volunteers a year in the United States. I mean, this is a huge operation. So they're now 35 years old, and they're doing two things at once, which is interesting. The first one is that they're trying to do a discernment about what they think their Christian vocation is now in the 21st century. They very much believe in what they call the theology of the hammer, which is, in other words, getting people to work together. That's how you do things. But at the same time, they are doing a lot of work with interfaith because they're convinced that that's the way to go. And so they're doing 6 pilots this year in U.S. cities. They've done some overseas. But we're trying to monitor this pilot of what happens in Atlanta, New York, Seattle, Denver, Los Angeles, and Grand Rapids, I think, 6 cities anyway. So that's a sort of practical way that some of this works out. But part of my point, and when I say there's no faith sector, and the world is not divided into people of faith and people not of faith, it's this huge mosaic. I call it the Milky Way sometimes, of institutions and ideas and feelings and so forth. It has to be worked out case by case. But as a first step, we can deal with the ignorance. And we can also try to deal with some of the prejudices that have stopped people, that have blinded people from seeing or from taking seriously something that is so important to poor people in the world, that it should simply not be something that's left in the dark. Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask, I sort of follow the center's work. I actually graduated from Georgetown as well in 2008, and I didn't have opportunity to take class, but I took class with Caroline and Katherine. And I noticed recently that the center's been sort of interested in the intersection between religion and philanthropy, and particularly when we were talking about interviews, the project about faith inspired development project. So I was wondering kind of like if you could talk a little bit about that project and sort of like how you select people for these interviews, how people come to your eye, and sort of, I guess, sort of just elaborate on that project in particular, and where you're sort of, what the center is envisioning with that project in mind, and the role in general, sort of the religious
The Religion and Philanthropy is actually a broader project in Georgetown, which is looking at philanthropy, and they've asked me to write a paper, which is a sore subject because it was due some time ago. So in any event, it's one of the things on my list that I'm working on. I'll work on it on the train if I can't take a plane to Washington tomorrow. But what we do generally, first of all, the issue of philanthropy, I think, comes to a fundamental issue which can be a difference between the worlds of faith and the worlds of development if you accept that there are some kinds of lumps, which I don't necessarily accept. But one of the things, for most of human history, and this is true, I think, in the beliefs of most religious traditions, the concept that the poor shall always be with us was very deeply ingrained, and it was perfectly reasonable. Because for most of human history, most people were poor. It was a tiny fraction of people that were not. I think in Europe, even 150 years ago, the estimates are 60% of people or something were malnourished for most of their lives. 25% of children died before they were 5. People died at 40. So the idea that, you know, poverty was always with us, it was inevitable, it was part of life, is deeply ingrained in many religious traditions, angry as it makes people. And so charity, in many ways, was as much for the benefit of the giver as for the receiver. And it was very much just, you know, alleviating pain and suffering. There was very little idea that you were going to change that. So the concept that we now have, which is that we can end poverty. Now, that's what people are talking about. We want to end poverty by 2020 is sort of the current thing. And we can. You know, you've got Singapore, which went from a complete dump to being one of the richest countries in the world where you don't have poverty. I mean, this idea of educating everyone, of having health care, is within our sights. And to me, that changes the whole equation that we have a responsibility to do something about it, now that we know that we can. But what that does is it forces a change in the way you think about charity. I mean, charity has always had its strengths and its weaknesses. I mean, the strengths are compassion and so forth, but the weaknesses can be patronizing. I mean, you have to look at Maimonides and his sort of 5 layers of looking at poverty, at giving and philanthropy. So that, I think, is the first thing, and that one of the pieces that I circulated to you was sort of my effort to try to put a hierarchy, because I do think that if you think about human rights and a right to development and a right to education and a right to water, which is all things that we talk about, it changes the whole way you think about it, because you no longer think, I'm giving you this money because I'm so kind. I'm doing it because it's just. It's a part of the way that things should be. So that's the rights-based approach. But it doesn't mean that you don't have charity and compassion. But we have to work out whole new relationships between charity and rights in light of the changing world that we have. And that's going to, of course, every religious tradition has different ways of looking at charity, and that's one of the things we're looking at right now, is trying to sort of document some of them. But it is very much unresolved, and the role of philanthropy, I mean, you know, the Gates Foundation and what have you, are going to need a lot of continuing thinking. Now, how do we choose people to interview? There's an organic process, I would describe it. That means that you know somebody and you talk to them, and these interviews take, the ones that are on our website take me probably 8 hours, and I haven't always got a whole lot of 8 hours around. So, and some of my colleagues do them, but I've tried to be very clear that they have to be rich in substance or we don't put them on the website. On the other hand, I have found that having a record and making these available has been incredibly valuable for us. But the last thing that I want to suggest is that it's scientific. So, but it is finding people. One of my greatest frustrations is I have about 20 interviews that people won't let me use because they are not sure that they've spent enough time editing it, or they're concerned. So anyway, they sit in my computer. But someday maybe I'll persuade them.
Just one more question before you move over to the other side.
Yes.
Can I ask, you said that one of the mistrusts that the church has is that we see the creed to be greed, so to speak. And now when you say that it's possible to get rid of poverty altogether, do you imagine that being possible in the current economic system?
Well, what you do is you touch on one of the most complicated issues where, when I say tough issues, I should have mentioned it because it is fundamental and important, which is the question of growth and how growth relates both to social justice in the world but also to the environment. Because if you scratch virtually any economist, virtually anyone, I think, you're going to find that there is not going to be poverty alleviation, and there's not going to be a better world unless you have economic growth. That's a sine qua non. But in many, many religious settings, there are many people who are deeply suspicious of that as an assumption. Now, some of it is what I would call, and this is my own bias, a romantic view of life, that we're going to go back to village life, and people are going to stop living in the cities, and they're going to lead a simple life, and that's really what we're after. And I think that it's dangerous to romanticize traditional life, because the facts that I was giving you before, I forget what the numbers are, but the numbers of people who were in servitude 150 years ago are very high. Does anyone know what it is? I think it's something like 60 or 70% of people were either slaves or serfs. You know, we really don't want to have that world. But we have a lot of dialogue and discussion to do about how you balance this need for economic growth, which is what creates jobs, which creates opportunities for all of you, which gives the resources for education and health, with the damage that that does to traditional society, to the environment, etc. If there is one topic that I think has to be high on the agenda, it is the equality and equity issues of how can we in the United States have this increase in inequality and the extraordinary proportion of resources that are held by the very wealthy. It just seems completely unsustainable in any imagination, not let alone the analysis of it. So, you know, we do have a world which is now 7 billion. It's going to go to 10 billion. If you want to have every one of those people having a decent life, you're going to have to figure out what they're going to do, and hopefully they're going to be educated. So we've got to figure that out. Just to give you one story, I was at the Fez Festival, which Brahim mentioned in Morocco, has this panel, and one of my favorite memories from the Fez Festival is that the head of the World Trade Organization was there, and he was on a panel with an Algerian French radical who recommends basically, you know, organic food and going back to the traditional ways and so on. What was, I'm afraid, a common pattern in many places is that they weren't listening to each other. They were busy. I don't know if they had their Blackberries or whatever they had, but they weren't listening to each other. And so you get Michael Moore saying, let's imagine a world where every Chinese family has a refrigerator and a car. And later in the same panel, the other guy says, let's imagine a world where every Chinese family has a refrigerator and a car. And for Moore, this was the dream. But for the other guy, it was the end of the world, because there's no way that you can, with current mechanics. And the two of them they didn't even hear that the other had said the same thing. So I found that utterly fascinating and deeply frustrating, which is why I say I think we've got to start confronting these different issues. I mean, at the Parliament of Religions a few years ago, this was in Melbourne, Australia, I was running 22 sessions on religion and development and, you know, all the issues, health, environment. But there was also a huge part of the meeting. These are meetings with 10,000 people who come from all over the world. There was a whole group on sustainable development and so on. And because of the way that it was structured, even though we had talked in advance about having some collaboration, there was no overlap. And you had different people going to the environment ones, and it was just before Copenhagen. And then you had different people going to the development. And so finally at the end, because I knew the person who was running the environment side, we managed to force a common meeting. And I started talking there about, you know, this sort of blabbing on about ending poverty and the importance of I think I said, you know, shared growth or whatever. And they jumped all over me. You know, the environment is almost dead. You know, you can't talk about growth. We've got to talk about something else. And what I realized there is that even though these are people who share deeply the same concerns about the welfare of the world, but have very different priorities. Now, you're talking about something different, which is, I mean, you're talking about really the very common religious perception, which I referred to as empire, that the organizations are really serving the interests of the big companies, and that they are extracting from mining, and that it's just a fundamentally unjust world where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I think it's more complicated than that. And I think that that's an issue we have to deal with, but I think we also need to deal with the whole range of these different ways of looking at the world and where we're going.
You will soon see most of these people in the other room, but some might have to go. But I want to take the opportunity to ask a question, or maybe just see how you struggle with this issue. So you said that there are people who care about the world, that share about the world, but it seems that people also care differently. And I'm thinking particularly about the caring about, on the one hand, security, on the other hand, the overall health of a particular nation or people. And I'm thinking particularly in the light of developments in Pakistan this year, and in the aftermath of the killing of Osama bin Laden, Dr. Shakil Afridi, who did this hepatitis tests on various communities, and then in Abbottabad, and then that led to him identifying, and he was the medical doctor and led the CIA and intelligence to Osama bin Laden's hideout. But a number of health workers
were just shot,
and shot in Karachi, in several other places, who were doing polio vaccinations and so on. And you talked about instrumentalization, and how this instrumentalization of good causes turning into toxic political issues. And I think it's similar to the ones that you raised earlier in other contexts. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how does one grapple with these questions and these issues?
Well, first you're dealing with a sort of cultural issue of the development institutions, and it comes a little bit to their arrogance and their self-confidence that they know what's best, and it's something that the development world has become more conscious of, at least, that humility and wider understanding and reaching out to people is fundamental. But it is, people work very hard, they're making efficient use of their time. It's, in a sense, it's this business ethic of, you have to measure it and you have to have results. I'm very allergic to the results culture, because I think it just gets you into these kinds of traps. But what that leads to, if I talk and say, well, in DRC, where there's a failing state and the churches are very influential and they run a lot of the health and the education system, we should be talking to them. The first thing is, well, what can we do to get them to preach sermons? I mean, it's a very
mechanistic approach.
And it's not stupid. I mean, their view is we can't waste time, just talking about it. So somehow you've got to give enough of a framework so that there's enough understanding and respect. And by the way, that's also true. I mean, in one of the first meetings of the religious leaders, there was one Swami who I think talked for an hour and a bit or something. And Wolfenson was going completely crazy. I can't just listen to this guy. He didn't say anything. So I find myself constantly in this mediation of trying to say this. So I'll finish with one story that's I think it's a little bit in line with this. I was with the Council of 100, we were talking about the Islamic world in the West, and about the idea of a Muslim World Human Development Report, which I still think would be a very good idea. The Davos, sorry. So we were looking at education and how we could work with education, and with someone who was an Anglican priest, and we went to see one of my former colleagues in the World Bank who had done a big study on the education in the whole Middle East area. And so I went with this colleague who started sort of babbling on about Al-Azhar and a theological exchange program. He sort of plunged right into that because that was what was on his mind. And this other guy started pulling out his BlackBerry and was completely, going, I could see, what is Al-Azhar? And what does theological education have to do with me? It wasn't David Foreman.
I wasn't guessing it was David.
Could have been. But he was involved with David Ford. But in any event, so I changed the subject. This is me in the mediation role. And so I said, well, to this guy, can you tell me how you approach issues of values in curriculum? Because I knew that was a big issue. And he said, oh, well, our goal is a values-free education. And I thought the priest would die. That's exactly what he was most afraid of. Now, what this guy meant, as he made somewhat clear, was that we want to teach people to think. We don't want to have ideology in the education system. We don't want extremism, but we also don't want, but you could see these worlds. Just, how do you bring these two worlds together and try to make them hear each other? So I think that's, and so I'm very careful about not giving people the idea that they can have immediate access to people's sermons, because that's their dream. Let me write your sermons. Because it's a captive audience, every time, and you can get our messages across. Now, on the other hand, in Ethiopia, they're doing something really interesting. UNICEF and UNFPA are both doing what they call a development Bible, and they're sort of taking every one of the religious festivals and tying it to messages about child marriage and about sanitation and about nutrition, but building it into the theology, and they're doing it together. Now, I don't know how anyone's going to evaluate that, but it's generally, I think, the way you have to approach it is working in partnership in some way that has some basis of knowledge and respect. And that means the religious institution, one thing that some of the religious institutions have come out of the AIDS issue with is an awareness that they've really got to do evaluation. For a long time, what we heard was we're much too busy helping the poor to fill out ridiculous bureaucratic forms. That was the line for a long time, and we're a little bit beyond that.
Please help me to thank Professor Katherine Marshall. We will now move